CCUS is very topical. With the COP26 meeting in Glasgow, governments are busily rolling out their carbon capture objectives, and some of them are actually putting behind them their strategic pathways that they're thinking to get to their carbon reduction targets. And almost all of these have CCUS usually explicitly embedded in their strategies about how they're going to get there. Now, sometimes the strategies are not particularly clear and they're still being formulated, but it's clear that carbon capture in some shape or form is pretty much part of everybody's pathways to get to their soon to be announced COP26 targets. So there's lots of webinars going on done by the Carbon Capture or the CCUS Institute, etc., which mainly talk about strategies and policies. But for this webinar, we're going to talk about something completely different, which is really what actually is going on now in terms of operational CCUS. So the slide in front of you, all being well, is actually a map showing operational carbon capture and utilization sites at the end of 2020. And these are actually sites throughout the world that actually have a physical piece of plant or equipment in place, which should be operational. I say nominally operational, because it's not always clear whether the actual machines are running or not, but these are where there's actually equipment in place. And this actually includes using CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, but actually it's only those that are actually using anthropogenic CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, because an awful lot of the EOR work done in North America actually uses CO2, which is actually mined explicitly for the purpose. So I'll come back to that a bit later on. Now, of all the sites here, not all of these actually capture and store CO2. Some sites are capture projects where the CO2 is captured, and then often, having captured it, it's vented. So really the project is effectively a test bed of some sort of capturing technology. And some sites are literally storage sites where there is an injection test, or people simply bring around CO2 to put into the subsurface to test some sort of piece of equipment. Now, there's a nominal capacity around 48 million tonnes a year, and that's based on the sort of nameplate for all these projects. And to kind of put that in perspective, the UK puts out about roughly 370 million tonnes a year, and of that, about 100 million tonnes comes from our energy supply in some shape or form. So if we're going to go ahead and decarbonise the world, there is really quite a significant challenge there in terms of the capacity, and carbon capture is going to have to increase in a major way. If you look at the map, you can see that there's things in all sorts of strange places. I mean, Iceland, Spitsbergen, for instance, where they actually capture CO2 and try and inject it into basalt rocks. Down in Botswana, where they actually capture CO2 and use it to manufacture soda for glass manufacture. And there's various places in Brazil and also in North America where captured CO2 is actually used to make soft drinks and for foodstuffs. But the vast majority of it is effectively used for enhanced oil recovery or some sort of industrial use where it can be. So looking at the operational CCUS sites, this is kind of a breakdown. If you look on the top left down, you can see there's 48 sites that are we classify as commercial. Now, in CCUS speak, commercial is a kind of a moving feast. The only ones that are probably strictly commercial is EOR projects in North America, which are really in a kind of an open market system. Almost everywhere else, commercial really means a large-scale project, which has probably got some level of government underpinning in it. There's a number of other projects underneath there, which are technology demonstrations, R&D projects, etc. Some of these are quite large in scope, but almost all of those have some level of government support or tax breaks in some shape or form to actually make it work. If you look at the count of assets, this is a breakdown of the numbers. We see there's about 49 projects worldwide which are actually capturing and storing CO2 as an integrated project. 18 of them are capture only. There's 5 which are just simply storage sites, and there's a whole bunch, like 7 of them where actually the captured CO2 is being used for some further industrial purpose. An example of that, potentially making soda glass. So if you break down the operational CCUS and see where are they on the planet, this really comes to emphasize the importance of EOR in terms of capturing CO2 as it exists at the moment. So we think there's 79 operational projects, and that's actual physical sites sometimes, with 48 million ton capacity, as mentioned earlier, and about 38 million tons of that is used for enhanced oil recovery. And if you actually look at the breakdown by country, 23 of the projects that are operational are in the US, 8 in Canada, so basically North America dominates everything. And most of those cases, we're capturing CO2 from some sort of industrial site rather than necessarily a flue stack. And that's actually being used as an EOR product. On the very right-hand side, you can see a breakdown of some of the sites that are actually used for generating actually CO2 point sources, if you like. And most of this comes from natural gas processing. And in reality, that in North America is where hydrocarbons are being produced, and the gas stream that comes from the hydrocarbons typically has relatively high contents of CO2 or nitrogen, which effectively makes the gas unfit for selling into the gas grid. So you have to remove the CO2 anyway. So the CO2 is being removed to get the gas, natural gas, to grid spec, and they actually use the CO2 to capture it and put it and use it for EOR. And this has been going on a long time in North America, and actually it runs as a commercial project in its own right. And sometimes some of these fields are produced, and the balance of the economics between the enhanced oil recovery, the value of the gas produced, as opposed to the value of the CO2 is kind of swings and roundabouts depending on market price. And sometimes there's history of plants switching from one to the other as basically market conditions dictate. So if you look at it in conclusion, activity as it is today is absolutely dominated by carbon dioxide, which is captured from gas plants in North America, and also coal-fired power plant, and is used for EOR. And today, that's effectively most of the planet's carbon capture. So if you actually look at the map of the breakdown of where all these sites are, you can see that the top map, that's all commercial sites. And again, emphasize commercial really means at scale and excludes sites that are relatively small or are actually declared as being R&D projects explicitly. There are some Ceylon Aquifer sites in this, which are the ones you can see we're probably relatively used to up off Norway there, which is slightly in snow white. There's also some Ceylon Aquifer projects in Australia. India, Botswana, and Brazil have various CO2 capture projects which are used for all sorts of strange things, Coca-Cola, industrial stuff, food stuff, sometimes also as a feedstock for manufacture of fertilizer and other chemical projects. If you look at the map at the bottom, you can see what's going on in terms of EOR, and you can see the absolute dominance of EOR projects that are actively working today, and these are literally ones that are just capturing anthropogenic CO2. So away from North America, we have one in Trinidad, we have projects offshore in Brazil, China, which has a little bit of EOR, CO2 capture for EOR, but it's quite problematic to find out exactly what's going on in China, and certainly the scale isn't as large as you might expect from a country of its size. In Europe, there's actually CO2 capture EOR going on in Croatia, which is relatively low key. And there's also various projects going on in the Emirate states. Also worth pointing out, some of you may have read, there's actually direct air capture projects going on. And the one in Europe is actually in Switzerland. And these are basically plants which are trying to capture CO2 directly from an airstream and capture CO2 that way. Interesting technology. At the moment, the scale of them is effectively minute in the great scheme of things. So again, coming back to it, this is based on the nameplate capacity of all these operational plants, and really shows a breakdown of where all the gas comes from, effectively capturing CO2, and where it all goes. And this really shows that natural gas processing in North America, and also coal gasification and coal-fired power, is where the CO2 is captured from, and most of it gets used in EOR. And this tends to be quite different to the what you tend to expect if you read various government publications and stuff like that about decarbonising, where a lot of the write-up and the narrative seems to be around people are going to be capturing CO2 from power station flue stacks and capturing CO2 that way. And in practice, most of the carbon capture that's happened historically hasn't really done that at all. It's been completely different. A little bit about EOR, kind of, because it is important, to kind of give you an idea of how it works. Now, this was first done as an experiment in 1954 in Texas, but the first commercial scale operation, again, was in Texas in 1972, and that actually used CO2 captured from a commercial gas processing plant. But in terms of scale, a gigaton, so a billion tons of CO2 has been used in EOR in the US in the last, effectively, 55 years or so. But most of the CO2 that's used in North America, about 83% of it's actually mined. And by mined, it actually means people go out and drill wells into reservoirs that are full of CO2 or a very large content of CO2. And that gas is explicitly extracted from the surface for use in EOR. And the US typically is injecting about 68 million tons of CO2 into the oil fields. And if you notice, that's far bigger than the amount of gas that's actually captured from carbon capture plants. The US has got about 8,400 kilometers of CO2 pipelines. So there is an enormous infrastructure in North America, and there's a great deal of knowledge about how to move, shift, and process CO2 and inject it into the subsurface. And in Europe, we tend to be relatively blind and unaware of a lot of that in detail. The map at the bottom is out of 2009, but it kind of shows you where most of the CO2 comes from that's actually used in the North America EOR. So in green, you've got these various dots which sit in the four corner states there, the Mount Elmo Dome, which is where this is actually extracting CO2 from a natural source. And again, down in Alabama, there's a Jackson Dome there. And the various plants that are actually marked there with sort of the purpley color around them are sort of large industrial sources. And I'll come on to some of them in a moment. But that kind of shows where the big hitter CO2 sites actually are. And one of the things intriguing, if you actually look on the thing, there was 114 sites that were actually doing EOR, and that was in 2009. And all indications are that actually a lot more is going on now than then. So EOR is a big business in North America. Even when you take the carbon capture part out, people are deliberately using EOR. So going back to EOR properly and the history of carbon capture, this is the annual CO2 capacity, million tons a year, by project startup year. And this is for projects that are currently operational. Now, that's important because there's actually been an awful lot of carbon capture projects that have started, flourished, and died over the years. They've packed up, usually because without EOR, they're not really economic. And sometimes even with EOR, they're not economic. So on our records, we think there's about 450 projects that we've managed to track down, which are carbon capture projects worldwide. And of those, perhaps a third of them are projects that have been terminated simply because they're no longer commercial, or in some cases never really were. So if you look at this plot, the green blobs are EOR projects. The blue blobs are saline aquifer projects. And that kind of shows that saline aquifer really comes in relatively late in the day. And the scale of them is actually relatively small compared to, if like, the commercially driven EOR business, mainly in North America. And of those saline aquifer storage projects, a lot of them are driven by political policy. So Norway's in the lead there, and that's driven by their Norwegian tax policy explicitly to reduce the amount of CO2 vented. I'll come back onto that a bit later on. So looking at just the EOR projects, so these are the Eur projects dating back to about 1970. If you notice there on the very left-hand side of the plot, there's a 1972, which is the Val Verde gas plants. And we think this is the first and oldest operational carbon capture project anywhere. And it's been going ever since 1970. That was 1972, I think the first capture was. And it, over its time, the way that's worked has changed enormously. So they've had export lines that have been switched from methane to CO2, back to methane, back to CO2 again. So a lot of changing and switching depending on market conditions and the prices for carbon and or carbon dioxide, and the prices for gas or the oil product if they're using EOR. I've pointed out three projects there. The Great Plains Weyburn Middale project, which is a capture and exporting the gas into Canada. Central Gas Processing and Petronova. I'll go on to each of them in turn because they kind of show examples of what's been done and the sort of plants and projects that are out there, and to some extent what's involved in them. So the first one I'll show is the Great Plains Sinful Weyburn project. And this is actually the project, the Sinful plant is in North Dakota. It's the only commercial scale gas gasification plant in North America. It uses about 16,000 tons a day. And the reason it's there is there's a lot of basically low-grade coal in North Dakota. And the US government really wanted to basically burn it to help secure its energy supply whilst actually capturing the CO2. So it captures about 3 million tons a year, which is only half of what the CO2 the plant actually releases. And of that CO2, it's all captured and actually transported across into Canada, where it's actually injected into the Weyburn Middale oil fields for EOR. We think this is probably the first transnational CO2 shipment in the sense that it's actually a pipeline and industrial. And one of the things that comes up in policies about CO2 and carbon capture is that particularly in Europe, you may be looking at moving CO2 deemed as a waste across transnational boundaries, and there needs to be some level of treaty or agreements in place between host governments about exactly how this is going to work, and if there's a problem, who's going to pick up whatever liability. So, but this is the first example we know of transnational CO2 shipments at scale. So this project's captured about 28 million tons since it started, and the actual plant, the whole kit and caboodle, cost about $2.3 billion. So that kind of gives you a scale bar of the amount of money that's involved in these things. So these are not cheap. Roughly, you could argue that the carbon capture part of this project, the capture and EOR project, may be half of the total cost. So about 1 billion for the Sinful plant and 1 billion for the carbon capture part of it. And this was co-funded by the United States government. So the taxpayer who kind of helped stump up the cash is getting his, some money back because there's a revenue sharing agreement with the actual power plant and the EOR. And it looks like the taxpayer is actually probably doing all right on this one, in stark contrast to some of the other projects we've done right. So this is an example of a project that seems to have gone reasonably well. It's pioneering in its scope at the time. So looking at where the gas goes, so if you look at the top left-hand picture, the little baby squares are the kind of 1 kilometer sections you have in Canada. The picture on the top right is kind of schematic. You can see loads and loads and loads of little red lines going down. So this is classic North American oil fields where you have vast numbers of wells, and you're injecting CO2 in the very last legs of the oil field production. So if you look at the chart on the bottom right, you can see it started producing in the late 1950s. There's various wedges of color, but the very latest bit is the lime green EOR, where you're actually getting the last bits of the oil out of the reservoir. From the CO2 point, it's more interesting to actually look at the amount of CO2 that goes in it. Now, in the Weyburn field, up there on the top left-hand side, you can see they're actually putting in 6,500 tons a day of new CO2, but they're also recycling 6,500 tons of CO2 that's coming out of the wells. So what they're doing is they're bringing new CO2 in, injecting into the subsurface. CO2 is coming out of the well with the hydrocarbon production. That's being captured and actually recycled and being put in. So far more CO2 is being put into the ground than actually is being, if you like, captured and exported to the site. And when you're looking at carbon capture projects and you see numbers of what's being done, sometimes it's very difficult to unravel what's, if you like, captured CO2, as in captured in a separate plant and taken to the site for storage as opposed to recycled. So it can be very difficult to add up and tally up numbers about production and what's going on that makes sense. But generally speaking, here you can see that about 2.4 million tons of CO2 is being used and 24 million tons is being stored in the Weyburn field. So there is a net gain in terms of the CO2 that's being captured in these fields. And that's typical of EOR projects, although it is an interesting and debated point as to exactly what proportion of the CO2 that goes into an EOR field is captured indefinitely. I'll leave that to EOR specialists. So looking at a different example of a capture plant, and this is an example of a classic coal-fired power station, where essentially you're capturing the CO2 that comes out of the flue stack. So this one is located in Texas. You can see a little picture on the top right-hand side. It's down on the Gulf Coast, and it's called the WA Parish Power Station, Generating Station, and that's actually capturing its CO2, and it's putting in this in the West Ranch oil field, which is a number of kilometers off to the southwest. So this was the world's largest post-combustion capture project. By that sense, it is capturing CO2 from the flue stack of a coal-fired power station. It's a retrofitted capture plant. The power station's been there for years. So they basically built this on to capture the stuff that comes out of the flue stack. Captures about 1.4 million tons a year. So that's about 90% of what comes out of the flue stack. About $1 billion cost to put this in. That's for the CO2 capture plant. That's not for the coal-fired power. This is the cost of the retrofit, and it's partially taxpayer funding. And the capture CO2, of course, goes across to the oil field. Now, this started in 2017, but has turned out to be a bit of a nightmare for all sorts of reasons. The plant clearly hasn't worked anything like the way that it should have done, and they've also had technical problems with actually injecting the CO2. That, combined with relatively low oil prices, has just turned out to be an absolute nightmare. And during 2002, the actual capture part of this plant was mothballed and shut down simply because it was uneconomic to keep running it. Now, this is also partially taxpayer funded. And if you read through various commentators and critics about CCUS in North America, they often cite this as being a good example of how to get rid of taxpayers' money. So you'll find lots of references to this if you look at people that are complaining about the US government wasting their tax. Looking at another thing, this is the classic gas processing plant. So you can see a kind of map up here on the top right-hand side. So there's the Gulf Coast in Texas. This is way out in the middle of Texas, out in the oil fields to the west. And this is essentially a gas processing plant. You can see kind of a look-down view from a satellite. If you notice, there's some vehicles there, which give you an example of just how big this particular piece of equipment and sheds are. Now, this is run by a partnership of Occidental. Now, that's Occidental Petroleum, as used to be in the North Sea, and Oxy, I think, are the largest EUR license and project holder in North America, if memory serves right. Sandridge are another big EOR company. Kinder Morgan are an extremely large North American company who specialize in producing and transporting carbon dioxide for EOR. They are by far the world's largest CO2 producer and shipper, and know probably everything there is to know about moving CO2 around. Very few people out of North America seem to be particularly aware of what they're actually up to. Now, this plant is the largest single industrial CO2 source in North America, and basically what it's doing is extracting CO2 from the high CO2 natural gas streams from the gas fields around that area. The CO2 is captured, processed, and then piped about 260 kilometers into the Occidental's Permian Basin oil fields. Now, this captures 8.4 million tons, so it's the single largest carbon capture plant on the planet that's running at the moment. And you can see originally started about 5, and it's been uprated over the years. It's about $1 billion worth of capital to actually set this plant up. Now, in North America, typically, it's shipped to Occidental's Permian Basin oil fields for EOR. There's an entire distributed gas grid for CO2 in certain parts of West Texas. So this is literally sold as a commodity to anybody that wants to join in. So they have a distributed gas grid for CO2, the same way as you'd have a distributed gas grid for methane to your gas burners, in Europe. So the way CO2 is moved in North America is very difficult, or very different to the way it would be moved almost anywhere else on the planet, and probably going forward the way that anybody would try and do it. So that kind of showed 3 examples of effectively EOR projects, big projects, the size of them, and the amount of money and scale involved in them. Now, switch a bit, kind of look at the Sail on Aquifer projects. You can see They started later, 1995 where someone started up. And the actual capacity of them is much smaller. So the biggest of these is just over 2 million tonnes a year compared to the 8 for the century gas processing. Again, this is only for currently operational saline aquifer projects, because some of you may remember that BP had a saline capture project running in Salah in Algeria, which was shut down in about 2010. And that is an example of, if you like, a nice project worked well, but actually they had problems with possibly the injections triggering faults and inducing seismicity. And that one was shut down. So that's not on this particular chart. You can see Sleipner and Snow White, which are projects that, if you're UK-based, you'll be relatively familiar with. And it also has the Shell's Quest project, which is in Canada, and is perhaps an example of the sort of thing we're more likely to see going forward. So here's Sleipner and Snow White. I've kind of gathered them together because they are, if you like, peculiarly Norwegian, and they actually are examples of a specific way of doing things. So Sleipner started first, 0.9 million tonnes capacity. Snow White a bit later, 2008, a little bit smaller capacity. Now, both of these projects are really premised on the fact that the gas they're producing from the subsurface actually got high CO2 content, and the CO2 had to be removed anyway. In Snow White's case, simply to get the gas to the specs, you can put it in your LNG carriers, and in Sleipner to put it into the gas export grid. So they had to remove the gas anyway, so all that equipment to separate out the CO2 was there. And in fact, the storage part of the carbon capture is really just a matter of injecting it into a suitable aquifer that's relatively close to your field. So in Sleipner, it's almost above your producing hydrocarbon field. In Snow White, it's underneath. And these are really underpinned by the Norwegian CO2 tax, which I guess is a pretty good example of, if you like, a political drive to actually move the industry in a particular direction. So in these two, really, the gas is essentially processed on site and is injected into a saline aquifer, which is more or less on site. I mean, the Snow White gas gets moved to the island and back for processing, but we're not moving CO2 over great distances. So these are, I keep on thinking of them being a kind of capture sites of opportunity, where you have to capture the CO2 anyway to get your product to the market quality, and you're just basically, rather than throwing it away or shoving it up a vent stack, you're just putting it to the subsurface. So nice little projects, very efficient. Slightly different project, and this is a much bigger in terms of general thought. This is the Quest carbon capture project, and this is way up in Alberta. And this captures CO2 from a thing called Shell's Scotford upgrader. Alberta has oil sands, very heavy bitumen oil sands. And essentially the upgrader project takes this and turns it into Sinful. So it's a big industrial plant that takes horrible sludgy tarry stuff and turns it into some more usable hydrocarbon commodity. And what they've been doing here is capturing the CO2 and actually injecting it in some distance away, about 65 kilometers, but into a saline aquifer. A classic example of how a saline aquifer storage should work. About 1.2 million tonnes per year, started in 2015. And to give you a scale, to kind of put this into units and maybe more familiar people working with hydrocarbons, these two CO2 wells are putting about 62 million cubic feet a day at the wellhead conditions. CO2 is usually measured or quoted in tons, etc., but that gives you an idea of what it's like at the wellhead in terms of volume. Pressure dependent, of course, but that gives you an idea of the sort of scope involved. Again, this cost about $1.4 billion as Canadian dollars, and significantly sponsored by the Canadian government, who actually supported it. Now, the last line there gives you an example of what they think the OPEX and CAPEX are. And this came from a presentation that one of the Shell people involved in it gave last week. And they were saying that they think this runs currently at about $25 a ton OPEX for the CO2 capture. And if you put in the CAPEX element, about $80 a ton. Though the interesting bit that came from their presentation was that they said if they built this today, they think they could reduce those numbers by perhaps a third. So if like the learning that Shell has had from doing this means they can reduce the cost of doing this sort of thing significantly. And that certainly features in some of the thinking that Shell had in their ways of looking at how to capture CO2 going forward. And they were quite open about presenting this and saying, they can use this as a successful project, but very much a learning project, and the next one will be much better and much more efficient. So a little bit kind of look back and concluding about world CCUS projects, where they are today. Now, most of them are EOR related. Most of the projects are at scale. Most of them are undertaken by the oil and gas business in some shape or form. And really, they're based on incremental oil production. That's where the money is coming from to actually drive a lot of this. Now, some of the big projects have been sponsored by governments, and there's a checkered history there. Some of them have been successful, others less so. And there are certainly commentators in the US that have written quite large criticisms of government sponsorship and support for CCUS projects. And it really says, generally speaking, the governments haven't done particularly well about this in the past, and basically encouraging governments to think more carefully going forward about how they might want to do this if they're going to start rolling out CCUS at scale. Sale on aquifer storage projects are almost always underpinned by government policy, tax system support in some shape or form, simply because there's simply no commercial rationale to kind of make these things work otherwise. Most of the projects are effectively a single source, as in one oil field, plant, etc., and single sink. There's one reservoir, so there's a pairing of source and sink, and that's it. The counter exception to that is the Permian Basin in the US, where essentially CO2 is commodified and people can buy it and put it into their own oil fields for EOR. But single source, single sink is kind of the general story. So what's coming forward? Looking forward, things are very different. Part of the COP26 process has really spurred governments and lots of commercial entities to churn out loads and loads of suggestions and ideas of projects. Now, we've managed to identify 126 active projects. Now, by active, that means we think someone is spending some level of effort and time and money in thinking about them. But sometimes it's very difficult to know whether these are anything more than a bit of aspirational thinking, or actually there's engineers that are thinking really quite hard about how to do this and kind of running through numbers. A lot of them involved hubs and hydrogen, as people looking at hydrogen grids and CCUS as part of that. Some of them are quite well thought through, others are somewhat vague, to say the least. We've managed to enter about 24 EOR, these are mainly in North America, and about 43 of these are sale on aquifer storage projects. Almost all of these going forward are going to rely on some level of, if like government incentive or funding mechanism, which is often vague. In North America, there's this 45Q tax policy that's coming out, which will has clearly incentivized people in North America to start thinking about how they might actually do more North American projects. I guess for Europe, UK and Europe and Australia, people are awaiting governments to come up with, what's the plan, which really comes down to if you're going to do large-scale CCUS, as taxpayers, we're all going to pay for it, but how does this kind of filter through the system? So looking at various visions for the future, to do a CO2 reduction to match any of these targets, the scale-up required is absolutely enormous. And the EOR business as it exists just isn't going to be able to meet the scale required. It might do something useful in North America, but outside North America, I don't really see how that's going to go. People are looking at how you're going to get CO2 from these numerous industrial sites, essentially put them into common stores. And there's the idea of actually looking at CO2 as a service. So entities are kind of thinking, I will come and basically collect your industrial CO2 and take it away from you. Much like the council taking away your rubbish in your bins. So that's a model that's being put out there, and loads of governments kind of looking at this, thinking, okay, how are we going to do this? What's the model to do it on an industrial scale? Who pays? The kind of maps at the top, I mean, the one on the left-hand side shows some estimates of sort of the amount of CO2 that could come from the various, it's like industrial clusters in various parts of the UK and Europe, and where would you could put them. And I mean, lots of ideas about how you gather this and shove it off into the North Sea, some well thought through, some less so. On the right-hand side, you can see carbon storage models have been put together for North America. And again, these are aquifer storage, generally speaking, and these are working on the same sort of idea of find a large area of CO2, large industrial sources of CO2, work out a way of gathering together, taking it and putting it into some sort of store in subsurface. So these have gone from being single source to single store to much more distributed models and thinking about how it's going to work. The best example for this is the Northern Lights project. And this, as far as I'm aware, this is by far the most advanced in terms of people are actually building things. So this is Shell Aquifer, Equinor, and Total. It's a JV. They call themselves the world's first open source CO2 transport and storage infrastructure. So what they're really doing is looking to store the CO2 in the saline aquifer in this structure called the Eur structure, which is adjacent to the trough of the North Sea. Now, the size of this saline aquifer, 100 million tons of CO2 is reckoned, and they're kind of thinking about putting the equipment in place to do 1.5 million tons a year now, maybe scaling up to 5 million tons. And they're spending money. They've awarded contracts. They're putting their money where their mouth is. But the initial idea is to capture CO2 from Oslo Varm EFW plant, which is basically a waste burning plant, burns domestic waste. They want to capture the CO2 from that, and also the CO2 from the North End cement plant in Breivik. And it'll be shipped as in a CO2 tanker, a vessel, around to the west coast of Norway, where there's a natural gas park. It'll be tidied up, put into a CO2 pipeline, and taken pumped offshore. Now, this is really being put together as effectively a service. So anybody, in principle, should be able to actually make a deal with them, and provided you can get your CO2 to a quayside, be able to put it into one of the CO2 tankers, and they'll take it up there and put it in the subsurface for you. In terms of the scale, I mean, Longship is the if you like, the overarching project that Norway has, looking at how they could do this for, if you like, greater parts of Norway. But if you look on the map on the left-hand side, you can see that there's the store in the North Sea, and there's various arrows and lines going around. But they're beginning to think, how do they move CO2 from industrial sources of CO2, mainly based at the major port localities, and shoving them into the subsurface? And they've gone from single source, single store to multiple sources, one large store. So it's this CO2 as a service model, really. Elsewhere in Europe, everybody is up for CO2 hubs and hydrogen hubs. A lot of people are looking at these industrial complexes around major ports and thinking, do you go and capture the CO2, or do you have a single site? You manufacture hydrogen at the single site, you capture the CO2 from the hydrogen manufacturer, and you put the hydrogen into a local grid, and local industry uses the hydrogen, so when they burn it, they don't have CO2 in the flue stack. Lots of models about that. We've listed just some of the CO2 storage hub projects, and this is a very small set, but essentially every major industrial port complex in northwestern Europe has got some sort of project going on. And sometimes they are quite well thought through, sometimes they're a bit of an idea that's been sketched out, and some of these projects actually contradict each other in the sense they have ideas for using the same subsurface store in conflict with someone else, but they haven't kind of beaten out the details how it's going to work. But they've all got some level of commonality behind it. I guess these are all at the moment in the void, and everybody is waiting on, if you like, government decisions, be it at UK level, EU level, also in Australia, but exactly how these things are going to work. And that will be the trigger for fairly wholesale investment in them. The only example that contradicts that is the Norwegians, who basically have taken a lead of this and gone flat out for it. In the US at the moment, everything's running on this 45Q tax credits, but I guess the Biden administration may change that and increase it too. So going forward, almost certainly CCUS will bear no resemblance whatsoever to what's gone on previously in terms of the scope of it. So that's all I had to say in terms of a presentation in the form of sort of a PowerPoint presentation. A lot of the information, in fact, all the information that I'd shown you has actually come from the giant database. So have you got a database there, Matthew? No.
Yeah, that's got the Excel up.
Okay, right. So here is effectively our troves, as we call them, are supersized Excel databases. I mean, this is about 2 GB Excel data file. They all look broadly similar. We have them for hydrocarbon fields, etc. But in terms of general concept, we have a nice front page here. And behind that, we have loads and loads of data. So the real engine is this enormous data table here. And here we have listed all the projects that we actually know and have information for. So there's about 450 projects in here. You can see they're color-coded, so red are projects that have been terminated, sometimes terminated early, sometimes terminated after a lot of money's been spent. We have on-hold projects that are completed. Now, most of these were very specific R&D projects or projects funded with a very distinct intent in mind, and they've all been successfully completed. And then we have, if you like, the blue projects up here, which are projects that are active, and that includes the vast majority of these projects that are being put out as potential candidates for CCUS going forward. So each of these, in terms of handling it, we basically try and cut and dice everything using a series of dashboards. So really, if you wanted to find the Croatia project, that's the Croatia project, which is actually capturing industrial CO2 and using it as EOR in Croatia. I flicked to Algeria. I think there is 2 examples in Algeria, one of which was basically essentially a desktop study. And of course, the other one of those would have been the Insala project, which is capture is complete in the sense it's been shut down. So we have a whole bunch of cookie cutters here, really, that allow us to basically just surf through all the projects and sort them as we go. So I mean, you can see there's any number of tables, but here you can see the breakdown of the number of projects we have. So we've got 127 active projects, 123 completed, 79 operating. So we have various tables here that allow you to kind of cut and dice and sort your way through all of the data in this giant data table. In terms of what we tend to keep, there's an asset or project name. Sometimes that's quite difficult because they don't have a nice simple name as an oil and gas field have. The operator, as best you can work it where they are, location, some words summarizing the project, and then essentially every useful number or descriptor we can find about the size of the plant, where it is, how it works, when it started, how much CO2 it captures, etc., and who's funding it, and as we go further on here, where it actually physically is, and if there is if it's associated with a distinct subsurface store, we've actually captured all the geological information. Now, you'll see nothing on that particular table because almost none of those particular fields are actually working with a specific subsurface store identified. A lot of the ones that are currently active have they'll store their CO2 somewhere in the subsurface, and exactly where that is somewhat vague. For every one of the projects, we have like a bucket of information. So if we hit that, you go to a tab, and here we just capture all the information we can possibly find that's in the public domain about some of these fields and some of the projects. I mean, there's no particular order in this. I'm just hitting whatever one comes up in front of me. There's a vast amount of information out there on the internet. Everything we do is using public domain. So there's nothing, have no special access to information that's not available, but it tends to be very, very widely scattered, and it takes an awful long time to find it all. So one of the ones that we actually had was a WA parish. This is an example of one of the parish projects. So that's the power station that goes with, that's an earlier project for the power station capture that I showed an example in the talk. There's soda ash Botswana. This is how they actually been capturing their soda ash. We've gone a bit beyond just the CCUS projects, and you see there's a number of other dashboards here. So there's the US TASR database, which is a database of volumes and capture capacity for saline aquifers on the US. There's the CO2 stop, which is essentially the equivalent for Europe. There's the BGS UK field storage database, which was published about 2005, memory serves. It gives an idea of how much CO2 can be stored in the gas fields. There's the Global CCS Institute and the Nettle CCS Institute. Nettle's kept up to date. Global CCS one isn't as much as it used to be. We've also built a database of capture technologies, and that really was as much for ourselves, being not process engineers. We kind of got a bit lost with this stuff, so we basically started making our own database to try and figure out what some of this stuff is. Most of the capture technologies have, I feel like, a brand name, so almost all of these in practice are using some sort of amine-based fluid to capture the CO2, and a lot of it's patented, and there's proprietary mixes which, to be honest, defy simple examination, and it's just captured and left there for anybody that's a process engineer who wants to look this stuff up. So in very simple terms, that was just a very brief snapshot of what the CCUS database is. There's tons more in it. We've gathered maps, and we've got lots of plots and other information, but it would take an awful long time to show you what's in it, and I will spare you that particular feeling at the moment, and I will, all being well, pass the control back to Matthew. Have you got it, Matthew?
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks for that, Jeremy. Just very, very briefly before we jump into some questions, I would just remind you that we've got the other webinars in the series coming up in the next few weeks, and you can register for those on the website. We have had some questions come in, and we don't have a huge amount of time left, so I'll just pick a few of them. So are there any projects specifically aimed at enhanced gas recovery?
A few. I think there's about 2 that I know of worldwide. Not particularly big and not particularly large. In North America, I think with shale gas, there's plenty of gas and it's cheap, so it's probably not much economic incentive.
There was also one which said that wind power was previously had to be subsidised to make it work. What needs to change to make CCUS go from pilot plants to commercial?
That's a good question. There was a presentation done about a week ago by a couple of ladies who are working for BIS, UK BIS department, who are kind of obviously been involved in thinking about policies and how this is going to work, but probably something along the lines of you will be charged for producing CO2. So as an industrial producer, you will be billed for the CO2 you generate. So that will be the incentive to have someone come and collect it and take it away. Now, how that's going to work in detail is a moot point, but clearly that was something that they'd given a great deal of thought through. And they were saying that in outline form, the government might want to kind of put that up and subsidize it up front, but they were looking for it to be effectively open market as an ultimate goal. And by that, I think they really were talking about by the late 2020s, they were thinking that it should be, it's the same as having your bins taken away. You have to pay someone to have the stuff taken away, and if you don't take it away, you're going to get fined. Yeah. I leave the details to people who understand the policy better.
Just time for 2 more questions, I'd say. So as we move to hubs and clusters for gathering CO2 from multiple sources, how do you envisage CO2 quality being managed, keeping in mind that impurities can lead to flow assurance issues downhole?
Yes, and that's an interesting question, because people, if you go and talk to the North American people that use stuff for EOR, they seem to have a considerably less fraught relationship with CO2 and are a bit more relaxed about what they want to do with it. And they seem quite happy to shove CO2 down lines that were previously used for methane and swap them around again. So given that a lot of their stuff is out in the desert, and if it goes wrong, it might not be a problem. But I mean, inevitably, in Europe, it's going to have to be much tighter if you're going to have, you know, population densities around it. But yeah, good point. And one of the things that came up in one of these conferences was guys talking about capturing CO2 from waste plants. So they're simply saying that, you know, at the moment we dump stuff in landfill sites, generates CO2. How are you going to get rid of that? And the answer is, well, actually, you burn the waste, you capture the CO2. And the answer is, well, actually, if you do that, you end up having lots of small scale, you know, local council carbon capture sites. And they were saying, well, that's going to get interesting because the carbon capture plants are not trivial technology. They have, you know, quite high specs, and, you know, there'll be a lot of regulatory overhead that has to come with that to make it safe. So yeah, interesting point. I'll pass that on to process engineers, not my field.
That's now just past 2 o'clock, and I see a few people have had to dash. So I think at that we'll call it a day. Any questions that weren't answered, we'll get back to you with an email to answer that.
Cool.
And if you've got any other questions, again, fire us an email and we'll get back to you.
Cool. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.